Hi everyone, my name is Graham Stanton. I'm from Ridley College here in Melbourne, direct the Ridley Centre for Children's and Youth Ministry. I'm here with my colleague and research partner and friend, Rowan Lewis. We're going to be talking to you today about a research project that we've been working on for the last, 3 years?
At least.
3 and a bit years, called Your Story, researching the faith journey narratives of young Australians. So we want to tell you a little bit about what the project was about, why we did it. We'll talk a little bit about how we did it, but rather than get bogged down in the methodological questions, mostly we want to spend time sharing with you something about what we learnt about young people, Australian young people. Rowan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm currently at ACOM, the Australian College of Ministries. We're a sort of a flexible online learning college, and I look after pastoral theology there. We should talk about Converge.
Yes, we should.
Converge is an international network of practitioners and researchers who are seeking to inform youth ministry practice with research. And so youth ministry has been going on for a long time, and we've been practicing in all sorts of different ways, but more and more we've been seeking to furnish the practice of youth ministry with actual grounded research. And so in different corners of the globe there is different projects being undertaken by Converge as they seek to support youth ministry with research-based understanding. Now the Oceania chapter, which is what we're a part of, came out with this question of wanting to understand the spiritual lives of young people, but not just at a moment in time. There's a fair amount of research around which has surveyed young people and go, well, Generation X believed this and emphasized this, and then Gen Y and Gen Alpha, and it became these snapshots in time. But the question that the Converge team came to us with was, what shapes the spiritual lives of young people as they engage in spiritual journeys over time? And therefore, how can we understand these spiritual journeys in greater detail so that we can help the church and other Christians informed in youth work practice be more attentive to how they engage with the spiritual formation of young people?
But then the second is the local research. Like, how many times have you and I both been teaching a class of Australian youth pastors looking to disciple and evangelize Australian young people, and we say, well, in America, this is what we know about young people, so that's probably going to apply here. Or in the UK, they have these sorts of structures. Of course, the UK is sort of different, so we're so often relying on research from other places. So this was all about local. And then there's this journey thing. Yeah. So much of the research is about the snapshot. We wanted to know, what's the story?
And this became known as Your Story because I think there's a phrase that has resonated with me that you've said before, is that in some sense the Christian church has spent a lot of time talking to young people and not a lot of time listening to young people. And so very early on in the piece, we recognised and wanted to strongly emphasise that this represented a great opportunity to listen to the journeys of young people and, in a sense, invite them to speak back to churches and mentors and disciplers over their life course to say, this is what has been significant for me, this is what has been influential for me, this is how you've shaped my journey for good sometimes and sometimes for ill.
Which maybe is a bit about the how we did it, in that we relied on a long online survey. 437 young people gave us a significant amount of time. And I think calling it Your Story, we really wanted to lean into them and say, we want to hear your story.
So some key things about the collection of data just really quickly is it was a large online survey that we distributed. To qualify for the survey, it was 16 to 20-year-olds. And I guess because our ambit was about understanding the spiritual journeys of young people and the insight that we wanted to gather, we wanted to be useful for people seeking to engage in the spiritual formation of young people. We didn't require young people to be Christian in order to take the survey, but our distribution method was through churches, through youth groups, through youth work agencies that have a Christian basis to them, or Christian schools. And so they were young people who've had some form of interaction with the Christian story, whether they identified with it or not. And so our survey method had suitably open questions that if you were more embedded in the Christian tradition, you could really recognize some of the language that we were asking about. But if it wasn't really part of your story, you could easily answer these questions anyway. The questions were, there are a whole bunch of short answer things that asked about their experiences of faith, maybe practices that they have, some of their reflections upon key people and organisations in their story, parents, friends, mentors, groups that they might have been part of, small groups and so on. But then scattered throughout was the real gold for us, which were these open-ended questions where people could write. And so those open-ended ones were really quite significant for us, and those kinds of questions enabled the young person to, in a semi-structured way that was fairly open, narrate their spiritual journey as it happened over time, to sort of zoom in on turning points in their story, and to reflect upon key people or groups or moments that were of influence. And we are still in the middle of analysing all of that data, and where we actually began and have focused a lot of our time has been on those open-ended questions, where we've been busy coding and analysing and starting to draw together some of the conclusions and frameworks from that.
Yeah. What we did was ask these narrative questions. So tell us about your story. Where did it begin? Where is it going? And sort of a lot in between. We'll spend most of our time thinking about the insights that we gained from looking at those stories. But those questions about what are your spiritual experiences and what are your spiritual practices and influential figures and so on, we asked these young people to reflect on what this was like when they were a child, when they were an early teenager, and now. And so that means we've got a fair bit of data that tells a bit of a story and a narrative change. We've used that to sort of categorize some of our data, but it also gives a sense that we'd introduce that idea of experiences change as you change, as you grow, and that got articulated then in these longer stories. So why don't we get into some of the stories as we think about moving into the substance, like what did we learn about Australian young people as a result of this work? So let me introduce you to three of the young people. All their names have been changed, but I'll describe a little bit about their setting. So we start with Riley. Riley is 18. Their faith story is one of flourishing from firm foundations. I grew up in a Christian home with Christian parents. I didn't have a big moment of recognition, but I committed my life to God with my mum's help when I was 5. I was frightened in a thunderstorm and found peace in the knowledge I had a saviour and protector. I then grew to understand in depth what being a Christian meant as my parents read missionary stories and the Bible to my siblings and I when we were eating dinner. I lost my grandfather when I was 9 and struggled with no longer seeing him again. I didn't doubt God, but I wondered what he was doing. I also knew that my granddad went to a better place and that you will see him again someday. I got baptised when I was 10, announcing my identity as a child of God and a follower of Christ. I wish to regularly commit life decisions to Christ and pray that his will be done, despite what I might have to go through. I ultimately long for his return and for peace about the concept of eternity.
Can I ask you just for a moment, what do you hear in that story when you read and reread that kind of story? What do you notice about it?
I notice the other people that were involved. So there's an intentionality from parents. There was negatives to the story. So losing a grandfather at 9 was a significant. We've got adverse life experience is the technical term for it, but this has been influential in their story. But it wasn't something that threw them. It actually was something that they were able to work through. And again, we'll talk more about that, about how those sorts of negative experiences get brought into or how they're responded to within a story to continue to move them forward.
Yeah, and that's been part of our question, is that whether people experience negative and disruptive episodes in their faith is not a feature of their faith, so to speak. Like, it happens to everybody. That adversity seems to be a ubiquitous experience, whether they call it doubt or something else. But there seems to be something between some young people who then go to the resources of their faith in order to navigate that difficulty, and some that throws them off kilter and kind of takes them out, or they access a different set of resources outside of their faith that ultimately leads them away.
And what influences one or the other?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, and we actually have an answer for it, which we'll come to. Yeah.
So we also encountered Jeffrey. He's 17 and lives in Sydney. He was raised in an Anglican setting, and his story is about he actually rejected Christianity of his childhood. I was baptised Anglican, christened in a church. My grandparents are very religious and set me on being raised Anglican. So I took separate scripture classes in public school before moving to an Anglican college. Now, my father is overtly atheist and my mother is agnostic. So most of my spiritual guidance before losing my faith at 13 came from my grandparents and school. I've always doubted my faith, but sustained daily prayers until adolescence. I cannot reconcile the miracles of the Bible with the laws of nature, despite agreeing with the moral guidance that the Bible provides. Any spiritual experiences I have had have been limited to dreams. That being said, I still love the principles of Christianity, save for the miraculous, and I strive to live by them to this day. Hence, I still read the Bible.
So I find Jeffrey really interesting, because if you'd encountered him as a young teenager, it's like all the signs are there. He goes to church. He reads the Bible. He's seeking to live a moral life. There's lots of these static indicators that this guy he's okay, but the story is more complicated than that. Yeah.
And there seems to be something quite around, in this present moment, this interactivity that occurs between the supernatural elements of faith and what he sees in the everyday and perhaps what we might call science. And so his struggle became the miracle stories as opposed to, and so on. And so that kind of interaction between science and faith is not quite right, but with kind of the supernatural elements versus the everyday, what we see, taste, touch and feel, sort of became the dissonance, the difficulty, the disruption for him, that the resources of faith weren't able to sustain him through.
Yeah. And what's interesting in stories like his, that there's not a lot of other people doing positive things or being involved in this reflection. That was a real feature of young people that had declining or deconversion stories, that it was largely an internal thing, or it was those internal factors that were more significant than external.
Yeah.
So it's not like people are talking them out of it. It's like they're just in their own little world. And my take on that is that there weren't other people around them, or there weren't other people around them in a way that they were able to incorporate their presence and their influence into their story in a way that would have a positive outcome.
Yeah.
Last one we want to introduce you to is Mei Ling. She is 16 and from South Australia, and she goes to a Christian school. She says, "My family is Christian. I can't really think of a time where I became aware of spirituality or religion. I think I was always keen to learn more as a kid, and the things church teaches is inspiring." So we ask, when did you take ownership of your faith? She wrote, "I want to develop my faith. IDK, he. Not quite flippant, but it's
jovial.
Yeah, it's jovial. It's a little bit light. Yeah. When we asked about the difficulties of her faith, she wrote, "Faith is difficult because IDK, I don't know what God feels like. And I've lived without thinking of God for so long. Growing up in a Christian school had its upsides and downsides, but I think being too sheltered and forced to be in a Christian environment has put off many of my peers from Christianity, and I would be lying if I said it hadn't negatively swayed me too. Although I have doubts and question everything, for me, there's no way that there isn't any God, because for some reason the possibility of that doesn't make sense to me. Lol. I just don't know that God very well." The immediate thing we want to say, you compare those three stories, and if you encountered them in their early teens, they would each look like they are committed Christians. They read the Bible, they pray, they go to church, they live Christian lives. But we listen to their stories, there is more going on. Riley is taking steps to grow in their faith. Mei-Ling is sort of like she's still there, but she's sort of just bobbing along in the middle. And Jeffrey is either on his way out or he is out.
And it's encountering these stories that we really became focused around this idea of understanding young people on a trajectory of faith. That you might encounter a young person in the context of faith and think, oh, gee, they're really going nowhere. I've known them for a couple of months and nothing seems to be happening. But there always is something going on. And just as you said, Graham, if we encountered them all here, we wouldn't necessarily have known that one person was going this way, one person was kind of going that way, and one person was going that way. At that same point, everything perhaps looked okay, if we want to use those kinds of terms. If you're encountering young people and they're on a trajectory, then when you encounter them, if you're seeking to be a constructive presence in their faith journey, in the same way that a trajectory has momentum, you're participating in that momentum kind of one way or not. There's another researcher, Christian Smith in the States, who's also done this longitudinal story analysis, and his metaphor was, by the time you come to young adulthood, you're a tugboat trying to turn around the QE2. They are on a trajectory. They've got so many experiences and things behind them now that they're heading in a particular direction, that if you're seeking to be a positive discipleship influence in their life, you're participating with something that's got momentum and trajectory and engaged, and your story is now interweaving in that, but it's in conversation with so many other things now.
And it's that multiplicity of factors.
Yeah.
That was, in one sense, a key finding, a key conclusion, affirmation of what this research was saying.
What, in the words of young people, did they describe as being positive or supportive for their faith perspective that they were developing? And at the same time, what, in their words, did they describe as being problematizing, compromising, or contrary, difficult for their faith journey? And so we can think about a young person growing up with supportive factors and contrary factors within their faith. Now, as we said, there's no smoking gun, there's no single factor, there's no single supportive factor that if this was present in a young person's life, then their faith journey is only going to go from strength to strength to strength. But what we are finding then is that young people narrate their story in different ways, and one of the things that we observed is that a young person who appeared to have a strong or growing faith tended to narrate a story that was filled with supportive factors. It's not that contrary factors weren't there, but when they mentioned a contrary factor, they then talked about how a supportive factor interacted with that and helped them to kind of grow their faith. So that supportive factors rated in increasing presence in stories of strong and growing faith, but also that they were the factors that were being utilized in order to respond to the contrary factors that were inevitably a part of their lives. Equally, then, when we listened to the stories and coded the stories of people that had low or declining faith, there was a great emphasis on these contrary factors and the incapacity or lack of supportive factors to respond and engage with them.
Positive stories, there is a greater preponderance of supportive factors over contrary factors, and it changes as you go to the deconversion and the no. There's no one thing that you've got to make sure that this is present. But then the corollary of that is, don't get freaked out by the presence of one or more negative things in a young person's story. And quite the contrary, actually. A number of the conversion narratives were full of contrary factors. They had lots of negative things, difficult things that they were going through. But because they were associated with then these other supports, both for them internally and what was offered around them and what they've drawn on in their story, it meant that that negative experience became a springboard for something quite positive. Doubt was a really interesting little subset of the...
And we know these categories feel a little bit blunt, but if we can think about consistently committed young people and then people who are growing in their commitment over time, and compare that to people who've remained low or disinterested in faith and those who are declining over time, and then we overlay the presence of difficulty, doubt, we've been using a bit more of a technical word, dissonance, kind of disruptive episodes in a person's faith. What's kind of interesting is that the consistently high, some of their stories can look a little naive and a little bit simplistic, and you kind of go, oh, that's kind of interesting. They narrate their story with very few contrary factors and not a lot of presence of doubt. And whenever the presence of doubt or questioning sort of comes up, sometimes they speak of it in quite dismissive terms. Oh, I doubted for a little while, but now everything's kind of okay.
I realised how silly that was.
Yeah, it's one of the lines, yeah. And so we get this kind of inverse sort of relationship where it's not in all cases, but in a number of cases of the consistently committed crew, there was a kind of an untestedness to that there wasn't this sense of it. There's no sort of trial by fire. Just everything's been fine, and it's not the case that they've just had a la-di-da life or whatever, but the presence, statistically speaking, was lower. Then when you get to the increasing faith crew, then the presence of disruptive episodes, adverse life experiences and so on became higher, but the resources of faith were very significant in them sorting through that process and sometimes restitching their lives together. When you get to the decreasing crew, you also get this higher level of adverse experiences, doubt, dissonance and disruption, but they couldn't figure that through with the resources. And I'll add in here now that a number of the contrary factors aren't things that are external to the church or are non-Christian. Like, yes, there were, atheistic commentary around this and so on, but a number of them were the way they were treated by Christians, the way Christians respond to them, holier than thou, like these kinds of things where they've had an adverse circumstance, they've tried to utilize the resources of faith to respond and engage and deal with that. Ultimately, they've been, quote unquote, turned off by that. It's been an incredibly negative experience, which has then reinforced their move out of Christian faith from there. And then when you get to the sort of the nominal folks, like they're tracking okay, they're being held in the Christian world, but there hasn't been a sort of a significant disruptive episode that has enabled them to really need to access the resources of faith, and so things become real. It's that internalizing process that seems to be quite important. Doubt, disruption, dissonance, contrary factors in faith, there's this interesting relationship that they can serve and often have served for the benefit of spiritual growth. They're not the antithesis of it, so to speak, but it's the experience of that and then the movement to utilize the resources of faith around them. And when a young person has, if you're more familiar with youth work terms, lots of assets, lots of supportive factors, as opposed to risk factors or adverse experience, when those start to line up, then they've got a lot of social, or what we might even call spiritual capital enablement that enables them to handle and respond positively to those experiences.
Here's Amalia. Amalia's 15, as she talks about her struggle with doubt. She says, I worried that I wasn't making the right choice and was not convinced that everything the Bible said was true, but through conversations with older people in my community, I learned that this doubt was the whole idea of having faith in something, to believe even if it was hard. She doesn't talk about now being convinced. It's not like, and now I was convinced the Bible was true. But it was the conversations with older people. So it's these external influences, but learning that there were resources that would be able to enable her to remain in this sort of place. For me, that's really helpful in that there's been a fair bit of commentary around doubt in youth ministry, young adult ministry. This is not saying doubt is good, and we need people to doubt, and it's admirable to have this sort of cynical, jaded, doubting position. It's not that at all. It's that doubt is present, but there are ways of finding a way through that to remain in a place of faith.
Two things that I'll emphasise as well that seems to be borne out by the data. One is we hear Amalia talking about older Christians helping her through this process, and that intergenerational connection was pretty clear. That one of the very strong supportive factors that really kicked in when there was dissonance at play was when there was the presence of older Christians in their journey. That was a highly supportive factor that was really helpful. The other thing here is this. They helped me to see kind of language is that a number of people spoke very strongly about sort of empowerment, I think maybe a way of saying it, or sort of respecting the agency of young people, so that it wasn't that other people solved it or gave them the answer or told them what to believe. There's this kind of enabling, empowering process that because of their interaction, I was able to X, Y, and Z. I was able to see X, and so there's this kind of, they are being respected for their questions. They're being taken seriously. The other adults or people that are playing a role are kind of offering a perspective and a take, but still leaving the ball with the young person to do the work. And that process was seen quite positively. Whereas when the kind of the agency was taken away from the young person, when they were being told what to do or left with a pile of shoulds and oughts and things like that, then the actual kind of response was that they were really sort of observing how disempowering that was, and there was kind of an allergic reaction to anything that was sort of perceived as a power play there. And so that kind of empowerment move, or one that still leaves the ball with the young person so that they need to do the work of internalizing and kind of operationalizing their faith with these supports, seems to be a dynamic that was positively viewed by young people, whereas when it was a little bit more draconian or standoverish or something like that, it was viewed much more negatively.
Well, we've got a very clear list of the things that we're trying to say here. First is that young people are on a journey. We need to look beyond the snapshot of what's going on for them in this moment and think about the trajectory of their faith and the momentum of their faith at the point that we encounter them. The second then is supportive and contrary factors that are holding young people. If their story contains more supportive than contrary factors, then their faith grows. If their story contains more contrary factors than supportive one, then their faith declines or never gets off the ground. It's not about finding one silver bullet supportive factor. It's not about avoiding the negative things, but about the mix between them.
Like it's like some people can be surrounded by the resources of faith but not actually access them.
Yeah.
And that's partly comes to that element of that kind of empowerment process. Is we do a tremendous service to our young people when we help them with this process of engaging the resources of faith in order to respond to the negative, difficult things will come. Can we help you to learn how to access the resources of faith in order to respond to? And that process of a friend of mine uses the metaphor of, like, we can help a young person develop assets of faith. They're like a backpack, but until you actually reach into that backpack and utilize those resources to respond, then they're just sitting there doing nothing. And so, sometimes in a young person's story, they'll tell you about all of these assets that were there, but then when they go through a difficult time, they never mention all of those supportive factors that were there. They just didn't utilize them. And
we might say, as hear their story and say, but there's all this stuff in your backpack. We put all this stuff in your backpack. And we sort of get a bit offended because we've done all this stuff. But if we haven't done the step of enabling their story, enabling them to tell a story that draws on these things, then the utility of those things is not present for them.
And so there is a tremendous gift of inviting young people to tell their story and retell their story and retell their story. That helping a young person to connect the dots sort of enables young people to recognize the significance of things that they maybe never recognized were there, or realizing that was a turning point and that across their life this person was consistently present, or so on. And so some of the conversations we've been having with youth groups and youth leaders around our findings have been thinking about the way of incorporating story more into the process, and that sense of, like, we've had young leaders say to us, we've been in small groups with the same young person for 3 years. We've done Bible study after Bible study after Bible study, but I still don't know their story. And through all of that, they've never had an opportunity to actually even tell it. We've been talking to them, but we're not really listening. We can think of there is ways in which we engage that form relational bonds and connection, and ways in which we could engage with young people that disconnect or form relational disconnection, and so on. And so when we line up some of the supportive and the contrary factors, some of the things young people say that were incredibly helpful in their faith was they were nice people, they were interested in me, they noticed what was going on for me, they were supportive through a difficult time. And there's a whole variety of statements which are about relational connection, about leaders, disciplers, other Christians in their life, creating bonds of acceptance, belonging and trust with young people. And that we began to notice started to form a very significant foundation or circumstance in which how their discipleship action was then received by the young person. So to the statement that we sort of keep coming back to is the nature of the relational engagement that you have with a young person really forms the foundation of your discipleship action. And so what we mean by that is, if we can think of discipleship actions occurring across a spectrum of gentle, caring, affirming, supporting, through to inquiring, questioning, through to accountability and challenge, maybe all the way through to confrontation and disagreement, you can sort of feel that on a kind of a spectrum. And what we began to notice was all of those seem to have an appropriate place potentially in the discipleship journeys of young people, but where young people received more confrontative or disagreeable forms of discipleship engagement, when they were couched in a relationship that was bounded by very strong forms of acceptance and belonging and trust, they tended to be received really well and were a constructive or a supportive process in their faith. When they landed outside of that, when some random went with a particular challenge for them or gave them some kind of spiritual ultimatum, it tended to be highly disruptive for them in a way that reinforced a sense of Christianity is really judgmental or manipulative or not really acting with their best interests at heart. And so where we're continuing to explore within the data is this sense that there is something profoundly important about the relational connection that we develop with young people, and it seems to form the foundation by which our discipleship action either kind of grows in its efficacy or declines, or can be received as either supportive or contrary. And so the same discipleship action in one relational context can be incredibly powerful, and in another relational context can be rendered quite disastrous.
Which is what we were saying earlier, like how do you distinguish? You do this thing, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. One of the key explanations that's coming out of these stories is that if you've got a sense of belonging, acceptance, belonging, and trust, then it's the relational capital thing. But it's a little bit deeper than that. It's that this forms this context which then enables young people to receive a whole range of different actions, because it's even the more passive ones that are received really significantly because they come from this person who I feel this deep sense of trust with. I feel like we're connected. I belong here. I'm accepted by this person. They just noticed me. And that becomes really significant. Whereas, this random noticed me, they don't even remember.
So this really came to the fore when I was studying closely the story of a person that we'll call Maya.
Maya's 20, and she is now reflecting back on her faith story, and she's got recollections of her childhood and then a sort of a conversion experience and then some later challenges.
Yeah. Awesome. So when she thinks about her childhood experience, here's her words. Both my parents are Christian. I was raised going to church weekly. I remember my mum telling us kids the story of Jonah and the whale by making us all sit in a little group under a blue blanket. My parents always focused on the love and service aspects of faith, and to my memory, they never used their faith to condemn or judge anyone. I think that was extremely important to me growing up. All my earliest memories of God are about his love and care for us and how we should show other people his love by being kind and serving them. So some of the things I notice about that is we've got Christian parents. The faith of the parents is appealing. In Maya's memory, like her memories of childhood are nostalgic and fun and enjoyable. Her parents appear to be active and engaged, and we can also see that from other parts of her story. I'm not reading too much into this. And then what I found really interesting, and here we get this connection between the relational bond really influencing the spiritual formation of Maya, that she says her parents always focused on the love and service aspects of faith. They never used their faith to judge or condemn someone. So there's something quite sensitive around that. Then she says, my earliest memories of God are about his love and care for us. You can really see this perceptions and engagement of who God is extending out of the relational bond with her parents and the way her parents experience faith. So this really strong interconnectivity between the discipleship outcomes of her experience of her parents and the nature of the way her parents were related to her.
So when she was 13 or 14, there was a significant sort of conversion experience. At the end of the sermon, the preacher asked everyone to close their eyes and bow their heads. And then anyone who wanted to commit their lives to God should put up their hands, which she did. Maybe a week or two later, after Bible study, my leaders pulled me aside and gave me a card and a Bible study guide aimed at teenage girls, and they said they had seen me put up my hand and wanted to encourage me in my faith. I was also confirmed maybe a year after that, but I think raising my hand and then having my leaders notice and support me was an even more important experience. Giving young people that opportunity to claim a decision, to express a decision, there's significance in that. But it's not the most significant. Even getting confirmed, there's a significant ritual action that's a premeditated plan of acknowledging a faith decision. But she says the most significant thing, the even more important experience, raising my hand and then having my leaders notice and support me.
And you might think that everything's going well for Maya and she's going from strength to strength, and then there's another encounter that happens a number of years later. But she describes this as an encounter with a quote-unquote bad youth leader. Now, this youth leader wasn't from her church, was encountered on a camp that she was on, and maybe her conscience was being pricked at the time, but she decided to, in her words, confide in this youth leader about her boyfriend because her boyfriend wasn't a Christian. But I love my boyfriend. My boyfriend isn't against my faith. In fact, he was a Christian in the past, but he left the church because of some extremely negative experiences that he had. And I seemed to feel uncomfortable about this. And so with this camp leader, she chose to confide and seek his wisdom on that. Now, the youth leader told me, in her words, that if I couldn't make him Christian, then I should break up with him because two people of different faiths aren't compatible. And it stressed me out immensely. And I tried to make my boyfriend Christian, but he didn't want to because of his previously bad experiences. And it really tested my faith to feel like I had to choose between my boyfriend or God.
Maya's experience of that confrontation, there was a confrontation, a challenge, an explicit challenge from this particular leader.
One of the things we grappled with as researchers is going, we only have the words of the young person. We weren't there, we weren't in those moments. We don't know if this youth leader was in fact incredibly kind and generous. What is, however, residing with Maya from this story is that she interpreted that as in some kind of terms of ultimatum, that being Christian and being with a non-Christian boyfriend is incompatible, and she's somehow going to have to choose between the identity of Christian or being with her boyfriend. Now she goes on to say, in the end I stayed with my boyfriend and I felt like I couldn't be a Christian anymore, and I'm still working on reteaching myself that I can be a Christian and love my boyfriend. So there's an internal agency thing going on there. I'm telling myself that I don't have to choose. I hope that one day he, my boyfriend, will heal enough to be able to come back to the church. But this encounter with this person was so significant that she wrote later on in her story that I want to come back to God properly. I am going to Bible study. I'm getting closer to going back to church, but I'm not there yet. Maybe in 6 months I'll be able to. Maybe even in 5 years I'll be back and confident in my faith as I once was. So this episode was so disruptive for her that she's already been processing it for a number of years and imagines that it's going to be many more years. She hopes she's on a trajectory towards becoming as confident in her faith as she once was, but this was quite significant and disruptive. One of the things that I observe here is that we have a form of maybe spiritual advice or spiritual conversation which was much more up the perhaps confrontative end. It made some statements in a way that Maya processed in terms of at an identity level. Can I still be a Christian and maintain my relationship with the boyfriend? And what I can't help but observe is this person didn't have relational bonds previously with Maya. There's no known acceptance, belonging and trust there. This was sort of occurring in a vacuum. It was a very strong form of discipleship, advice and engagement, and the net result of that was it was highly disruptive for her. As you keep going on through her story, you start to see the way that she's been accessing a whole variety of spiritual resources. Her church has consistently remained a non-judgmental presence, that whenever people from church see her down the street, inquire and spend time with her, and in her phrase, gently invite me back, in a way that she describes as being quite appreciative of it. Her parents have continued to be a non-judgmental presence who have continued to, in her words, accept her no matter the nature of her decisions and choices over time. And so she continues to have a memory and an association with her parents that's incredibly powerful and positive. And her small group Bible study is also a place where she seems to find a home. But there's this sort of abiding presence of God which he speaks about from her childhood and through her teenage years that has somehow become disconnected from her, and that she really desires to get back, but has experienced this very significant disruption.
There's a lot in this work. It's a rich data set. It's been fascinating as we've dug into these stories, and we're continuing to do so and to pull in insights from the other quantitative data that's alongside and around these stories. If I can perhaps try and sum up a sort of a final punchy so what for you guys as you think about discipleship with young people, perhaps I'd say that the relational bond is deeply significant. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient, because there are direct discipleship actions that are profound, and there are many more direct discipleship actions with the conversion stories, with the increase in faith stories than others. So it's build that relational connection, be bold and take up the privilege, the responsibility of speaking into young people's lives, but perhaps the biggest one is to honour their stories, listen for their stories, ask them their stories and give them the opportunity to articulate, help them to do that. There's great insight that we get as a result of asking. There's so much that we hear and benefit from, but then there's also so much that they benefit from in the opportunity of being able to tell their story to people who are interested.
I think that says it well.
Thanks for your time.
Thanks for your time.